Good evening, lovers of freedom. This is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, back with you for another Saturday evening to discuss ideas on liberty. And tonight we're going to be talking about money, gold, inflation, freedom, and we're going to be talking about the context in which these monetary principles are taking place, specifically the welfare state, the warfare state, because that's really the primary purpose of the system in which we live, the paper money system, the central bank system known as the Federal Reserve System. I mean, let's examine first of all the status quo. Most all of us, I would estimate maybe 98% of the American people have been born and raised under a system of paper money. This is the system, where the government issues irredeemable paper money. We've been born under a system with a central bank. There's 100% of the American people there. It's called the Federal Reserve. And so we've all just sort of become accustomed to it, much like we've become accustomed to Medicare and Medicaid and the welfare state and Social Security and, of course, the warfare state, under the euphemism of defense. We've got, all these warfare activities and militarism and a standing army and the CIA and the assassinations. And it's sort of like just a normal part of American life. And that's the way it is with paper money and the central bank. And so we're going to be talking about the context of these things as well as talking about the principles. And in order to do that, we need to go back to some founding principles because it wasn't always like this. The American people, when they founded the United States of America or brought this federal government into existence, the last thing that they wanted was paper money and a central bank, a Federal Reserve System. Now, keep in mind that when the American people called the federal government into existence with the Constitution, most Americans were very leery of a new federal government. They'd been operating under the Articles of Confederation, where the federal government had very weak powers. In fact, the federal government didn't even have the power to tax, if you can believe that. And so all of a sudden, here's a group of men that get together and say, look, there's a lot of problems with the Articles of Confederation. We're going to propose a brand new federal government. People didn't trust this. They were deeply concerned that you'd end up with a government with omnipotent powers. And those that were calling the government into existence with the Constitution said, look, you don't need to worry about that. We have a Constitution. The Constitution will set forth the powers of this government. Well, the people were concerned that the government would end up attracting status, or they didn't use that word at the time, but people who lust for power. Throughout the ages, there have been people who have lusted for power, just like you have alcoholics and you have drug addicts. There's people that are addicted to power, and they gravitate to power. That many of them can't make it in the private sector. They go into the parasitic sector, which, of course, is the government sector. It thrives off the private wealth that's being produced in the private sector. So people were very, very suspicious of bringing into existence the federal government. It was not a sure deal. Now, the argument in favor of bringing the government into existence was that, look, the powers of this federal government are not going to be omnipotent. This is not going to be a dictatorship. They're not going to be able to ignore the Constitution, because the Constitution is going to enumerate the powers of this government. And so they listed the powers in the document. So they said, look, American people, you don't need to be concerned. Well, the American people said, well, don't you think there's going to be people that are going to ignore these constitutional restraints? They're going to be exercising powers that are not enumerated. And the defenders of the Constitution said, you don't need to worry about that. That's why we have a judicial branch, to declare unconstitutional whenever these power lusters get into office and enact legislation that uses powers that are not enumerated. So that's the overall philosophy of the Constitution and the federal government, that this is a government of limited enumerated powers. If the power is if it's not enumerated, if it's not listed in that Constitution, then it doesn't exist. So now, of course, some statists sometimes will say, "Oh, well, we don't see that right in the Constitution." That's not the critical issue. The critical issue is not whether a right is enumerated in the Constitution, because rights don't come from the Constitution. Rights don't come from the government. Rights pre-exist the government. The critical issue is, does the power exist? Has it been granted to the government in the Constitution? If it hasn't been expressly granted, then it cannot be exercised, at least not legally. Now, the states were a different deal. The states were everybody understood the governments of the states would have general powers, or they would leave it up to them to decide whether to restrict the powers, and many of them did. They had state constitutions, which were many times modeled after the federal Constitution, that restricted state governments from exercising certain powers. Now, how does this pertain to the monetary sphere? Well, if you examine the Constitution closely and you look at the powers that are delegated to the President, the Congress, and the judiciary, you will find that there is no power enumerated to issue paper money. I mean, you will search in vain for any power on the part of the federal government to issue paper money. It's just not there. You will also not find any power to enact a legal tender law. That's a law where the government forces people to accept its money. In this case, the paper money, in the case in which we live today. So here you have a Constitution calling forth a federal government that people didn't trust because of the power lusters it would attract. But it's saying that you don't have the power when you bring this government into existence. You don't have the power to issue paper money. You don't have the power to make legal tender laws. Now, there was the power to tax, and there was the power to borrow. Okay, so the federal government could do both of those things. It could tax people. It could borrow money from people. Now, the states were in a different position, but to ensure that the states did not have the power to issue paper money, the Constitution issued a specific restriction. In other words, okay, we're going to let you, the states, have general powers, but with some exceptions. And among those exceptions was the monetary realm. They said that no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin legal tender. Okay, so no state could make paper money or anything else legal tender except gold and silver coins. And then the states were also prohibited from issuing bills of credit. Now, what were called bills of credit, they were simply referring to paper money. That's what they called paper money during the time. So they didn't want the states issuing paper money, and they said the states cannot make anything but gold and silver coin legal tender. Now, there was one power granted to the federal government in the monetary realm, and that was the power to coin money and to regulate the value of the money. Now, when you hear all these powers, the powers granted the federal government, and when you consider the powers not granted the federal government, no power to issue paper money, no power to issue legal tender laws, and then you've got the restrictions on the states shall make nothing except gold and silver coins legal tender, the states shall not issue bills of credit or paper money, and the federal government has the power to coin money. What do you conclude from all this? It doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that what the American people were calling into existence with this federal government was a way of life, a system in which people used precious metals as their money. Gold coins, silver coins, nickel coins, copper coins. I mean, it's absolutely clear that what the framers desired, what they intended, what the American people desired, and what they understood would be the case, was that this was going to be a way of life, a system, where people would use gold and silver coins in their everyday transactions. In other words, they rejected paper money. Now notice how different that is compared to the system in which we've all been born and raised. Because from 1787 or 1789, when the Constitution was finally adopted and the federal government was brought formally into existence, from that point all the way for some, 100 and some odd years, almost 150 years, the American people used gold and silver coins as their medium of exchange. This was the system where you didn't carry around Federal Reserve notes or paper money in your wallet or your purse or whatever. You carried gold coins, silver coins, copper coins. This was the official money of the United States. This is what is meant by the gold standard. Now, you often hear states say, oh, no, the gold standard is just too complicated because it involves an exchange rate between the dollar and gold, and how would we ever come up with an exchange rate between the dollar and gold? And, oh, all that's nonsense. You can reject it right out of hand. That is not what the gold standard was. All they meant by the term gold standard was that the standard of money that people was using, the money that people were using, was precious metals, gold and silver coins, copper coins, nickel coins. That's all it meant. It says that in this country, people are going to use precious metals as their money. That's all the gold standard meant. And that the standard of money, the official system, is gold and silver coins. And that's what people use in their transactions. For like I say, over a century. This is how people, operated in the United States. Now, why did they reject paper money? Why didn't they give the federal government the power to issue paper money? Why did they want to make it real clear that the states were prohibited from issuing bills of credit or paper money? Why didn't they give the federal government the power to issue bills of credit or paper money? Why did they limit them to the power to tax and borrow, but not issue paper money? Well, because they had read history. They understood what happens when governments have the printing press and they use paper money as the official money. You can't have a printing press for gold. I mean, we all know that in order to get more gold, you got to go find it, you got to dig it out of the ground, and you got to spend money to bring it back, and then you got to coin it and melt it down and so forth. The printing press is much easier, because all you got to do is just, turn on the printing press, put a little bit of oil in there and crank it up and just start turning the wheel, and you can just start having, $100 bills, $1,000 bills printing off, no problem. And the founding fathers, the framers, our American ancestors, they understood this. I mean, they'd had firsthand experience with it during the Revolutionary War. That's what the term "not worth a continental" is all about. This was the continental currency, where they were just printing continentals out the gazoo to finance the war effort, and they were worthless at the end of the war. I mean, absolutely worthless. There were so many of them, and they'd had this experience with inflation and hyperinflation and how it just destroys moral values, it destroys property. So they said, we want nothing of this. And they'd seen it happen in other parts of the world. They'd seen governments debase their currency, even before the printing press. When, in the olden days, when governments wanted to debase the currency, what they would do is they'd shave a little bit of a gold coin. When it would come in payment of taxes, they'd shave the outer edges. And then they'd put it back into circulation, and they'd use the shavings to pile up and make another coin. And of course, what would happen is that the coin would get smaller and smaller, the one they were putting back in circulation, until people figured out that it really didn't contain an ounce of gold or an ounce of silver or whatever it denominated. So it would start trading at a discount. And people realized, well, that thing's not worth an ounce because it doesn't have an ounce in it. And then the king would make that legal tender and say, no, you have to accept it at face value. If it says an ounce, you got to accept it at an ounce, even though it contains only 3/4 of an ounce. And they again used the shavings to put more coins into circulation, and this is debasing the currency for everybody. Well, that was inflation, inflating the money supply before the printing press. But once the printing press came into existence, man, that made it really easy for kings and dictators and democratically elected officials to just, flood the market with government printed money and, buy whatever they wanted, pay off their debts and so forth. But it was just moral debauchery. It was just stealing. It plunders people. I mean, it ravages a society. And the framers knew this. Another more modern example of hyperinflation was the German hyperinflation. After World War I, The government started just printing out the German marks, just out the gazoo. The printing press was cranking up 24 hours a day. It was taking like a wheelbarrow full of paper marks to buy a loaf of bread. And the people had to buy it that day, because the very next day it would take 2 wheelbarrows of marks to get the bread, because the printing presses were never stopping, and it was just widespread monetary devastation with this massive hyperinflation. And then of course a modern day example is Zimbabwe, where the government has just impoverished the entire society with just by flooding paper money into the society. Now the German example is kind of interesting, because the Germans learned from it, much as the framers and our American ancestors learned from the debacle, the horrible horror of paper money. That the German mark ended up being, after World War II, one of the strongest currencies in the world. And to this day, the Germans are very, very cautious. They're essentially in charge of the Euro system, and they've got the strongest economic position, because they understand the values of sound money. And of course, you take the other countries in the Eurozone, like Ireland or Greece or Portugal. Again, they're like the U.S. government, spending money like there was no tomorrow, borrowing like there was no tomorrow, and then they end up going bust because they've got this massive welfare state. They've got the same situation that we do, except we have it worse, because we've got the warfare state on top of it. But they just were spending out the gazoo. They were lying to people about how much their total indebtedness was, and finally, the market ferrets out that they've been lying. And the gig's up. They can't pay their debts. People say, well, tax the rich, tax the rich. Well, that only goes up to a certain point. You tax the rich to a certain point, and you destroy them. It's sort of like a parasite that sucks so much blood out of its host, and somebody says, suck a little more, suck a little more. Well, but if you suck a little more, the host dies. And the parasite knows that if the host dies, the parasite dies. And that's pretty much the situation with respect to Greece and Ireland and Portugal and so forth. Well, they can't print the money to pay off all these debts and so forth, because the Germans won't let them. Because the Germans are sitting there saying, no, your solution to your problems is get rid of all these massive welfare state programs. And of course, people there are just like many Americans. They don't want to let go of their welfare. They're addicted to their welfare. They're dependent on it. They've grown up around it. They just can't let go. We see that in this country with Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, education grants, SBA loans, stimulus funds. Everybody's, or not everybody, but lots of people are addicted to it. They can't imagine life without it. It doesn't matter whether they're sinking to the bottom of the sea. They're taking that anchor with them, and if you say, let go of the anchor so you can float back, they ain't going to let it go. And but that's what the Germans learned about hyperinflation. That the solution to excess government spending is to slash the spending. Don't start inflating the currency because of the horrific consequences. Even if it's done at a small level, 5% instead of 100%, if they're expanding the money supply at 5%, they're creating all kinds of perversions and distortions and false signals in the marketplace that produce these bubbles that we've had experience with, like in the housing market. And then, of course, the bubble bursts, and the status say, oh, it's all the fault of the free enterprise and greed and the banksters and the illegal aliens. They come up with every kind of foolish notion of a scapegoat they can, because they don't want to acknowledge that what's failed is their welfare state, their warfare state, and their monetary debauchery through paper money and the Federal Reserve. But in any event, the American people, they wanted sound money. They didn't want this system of paper money. They knew what governments do with this. They didn't trust the federal government. That's why you have a Bill of Rights, because they didn't trust the federal government. They wanted enumeration of specific important rights to them, because they figured the power lusters were going to come and start doing bad things to them. And among the bad things that could be done is with respect to monetary debauchery through inflation of the money supply, and specifically through the printing press. So that's why for 150 years or so, or almost 150 years, the American people use gold and silver coins as as their medium of exchange. I mean, if they wanted to go in and buy a horse and buggy or buy an automobile at the turn of the century, they walked in with gold and silver coins. Now, they would, of course, deposit them in a bank, and the bank, they could write checks, just like a checkbook or whatever, but everybody understood that the money was the gold and the silver coins. So if you walked into a store and you said, "Hey, how much is that horse and buggy?" It'd be quoted to you in terms of, how many, $200, gold, and the gold coins would have, $20 St. Gaudens or whatever. So everybody knew how to calculate, and much of the world was using gold as well. So there was like a universal medium of exchange. You didn't have to worry about a bunch of government-imposed different paper currencies. You go to France, you go to Britain, or wherever and else they use gold. Everybody calculated in gold or silver or copper. I mean, so everybody was accustomed to that. I mean, it went on for more than 100 years, like I say, more than a century, where this is the way of life of the American people. It's one of the distinguishing characteristics of our nation, the fact that we went as long as we did without paper money. Now, there were assaults that were taking place from the government. Now, how did the government raise its taxes? Well, again, through gold and silver. I mean, you'd pay your taxes in gold and silver. You might send a check to the government, but then the transfer would take place within the bank. The gold would be transferred from your account over to the account of the government, and so you pay in gold your taxes. Now, what about borrowing? Well, the government again would borrow money in the marketplace. It has the power to borrow under the Constitution, and it would go out and borrow gold, and it would issue a note. So somebody could look at the note and say, I promise to pay you, $20 St. Gaudens, or whatever the note was, it was a promise to pay gold. So when the government went out in the marketplace, now this is critically important, because this is where people get confused about this thing, that the government would borrow the gold, and the note would reflect that the debt was paid back in gold. So if I come and borrow an ounce of gold from you, and let's say that's a $20 St. Gaudens piece, I give you a note, and promising to repay that money, let's say 10% interest. 1 year from now, you present that note to me, I've got to pay you back in gold. That's what the note was. Now, we still see remnants of this, but notice something here. The note itself is not money. The money is what is being promised to pay in that note. Now, that's not to say that people didn't use the note. I mean, let's say they walk into a place and say, well, listen, rather than me, I've got this government note. Are you willing to take it? And the person says, yeah, it's good as gold. I mean, it's a government note. I'll take it. But it's not circulating as money. It's not intended to circulate as money. It may be transferred as a convenience. Now, what would happen, however, is the government would notice that not everyone would come and demand their notes at one time. That the notes would circulate, or they'd stay in people's account and whatever. And so the government said, well, wait a minute. If not everybody's coming in and demanding their gold, then we can just issue notes. Just put them out there in the marketplace. Go into a hardware store and use a note that we've just printed, and it won't matter, because 2/3 of people are not going to be coming in demanding their gold anyway. Okay, all right, fair enough. But what would inevitably happen is that government would start printing a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. I mean, this is the nature of government. They always want more. They want to spend more and so forth. But as soon as the market, the speculators, the entrepreneurs, they start figuring out what's going on here, that there's an excess amount of notes out there, then all of a sudden there's a rush to the bank and demanding their gold out of those government accounts, and that's when the gig's up. So government had to be very careful about not issuing too many notes because of that run-of-the-bank problem. That's what constrained government spending. It was that fear that people would come in and start demanding their gold. All right, so gold is the money. Government borrows the money. Government owes the money, but government starts printing an excess amount of notes, and all of a sudden there's a threat that there's going to be a run on the bank. The government has to be concerned. It's got to figure out some way to raise the money through taxes or whatever to honor those notes. Otherwise, it goes into default. That was the big constraining factor. When people say government didn't have unlimited powers to spend and the gold standard, that's what they were talking about. That gold is money. The note is not money. Now, we see remnants of this system today. I mean, if you look in your billfold, you'll see something called a Federal Reserve note. Now, what does that mean? Okay? Go into a government office, go into the U.S. Treasury and say, I've got my note, give me my money. Well, all they're going to do is give you back another $20 bill because that's what, it's irredeemable now. It's a promise to pay nothing. It's a promise to pay another paper note. But there's a remnant of it. I mean, it's very interesting that you've got paper money, but they've still got the terminology on there from the days of old. A Federal Reserve note that in the old days was a promise to pay what was the real money of the era, gold and silver or whatever. Now it's the promise to pay nothing. Now, of course, hardly anyone ever asks that. Why is it saying note? What's it promising to pay? Because we've all been born and raised in a system and everybody just takes it for granted. Now, one of the big reasons for the tremendous prosperity in the 19th century, and it was tremendous prosperity, and you hear the statists often talk about the horrors of the of the Industrial Revolution. Well, that's just nonsense. Their analysis is totally misguided. What they're doing is they're comparing the Industrial Revolution to today's times. Well, duh, yeah. Times are better today because you've got a much bigger base of capital. But back there, the 19th century, compare it to the centuries that came before, and it is the most unbelievable time that you could ever imagine in terms of prosperity. Because now, instead of people dying in mass, famine, starvation, illness, the poor, the regular people, finally have a chance to survive. Now, is it miserable? Absolutely. But as capital is being developed throughout the entire 19th century, people are actually eking out a living. They're forming a middle class. There's people going from rags to riches in 1, 2, 3 generations. Many of the rich were poor people who became rich. And you've heard me talk about this society is quite remarkable, notwithstanding slavery and tariffs and a lot of minor exceptions. This is an era that points us to the way, to what we need to be striving for. Imagine, no income tax. You kept everything you earned. No Social Security, no Medicare, no Medicaid. Total free market in health care. Free market in everything. There was no immigration controls, no drug war, no militarism, no standing army, no foreign wars, no invasions, no poking people's nose to produce the terrorist threat that then is used to take away people's freedom. No war on terrorism, and no paper money. There was sound money here, precious metals. Contracts were, like bonds. Corporations, railroads were issuing 100-year bonds, if you can believe that. And people weren't worried about, having the bond inflated out of existence. Why? Because they had gold clauses in there, promising to repay these bonds in the gold standard as existed at the time the loan was made. So let's assume that the government, 25 years after the bond is issued, debases the currency. It's got, let's say, a silver dollar, but it reduces the amount of silver inside the dollar 25 years later. When the railroad repays the loan 75 years after that, it's got to repay in accordance with how silver was defined at the time the note was made. And this is why people had trust to invest their savings in these long-term bonds. The government itself was issuing bonds with gold clauses. And so this produced an enormous infusion of capital that then was going into businesses, making them more productive. They were buying machinery, tools for the workers. That productivity soared, which then caused real wages of the workers to soar. It was the most incredible period. Add that to the fact that nobody had to pay income taxes, so you had all that money flooding into capital production. Sound money, no income tax, no welfare state, everybody producing, tremendous voluntary charity as part of this thing. Is the most remarkable period. Especially when you look at the period from around 1870 to 1890, incredible period in terms of economic prosperity. So they kind of showed us the way, that this was the way to prosperity. Well, there was a big exception, and it came about from one of the two presidents who were, primarily responsible for the destruction of America's monetary system, the gold system. Those two presidents were Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt, both of whom, not coincidentally, exercised tremendous dictatorial powers, in the height of what they called emergencies. Now we know about emergencies, right? I mean, that's what 9/11 was all about. Emergency, emergency, red alert, red alert. The government needs emergency powers. We've got a real emergency on our hands. Patriot Act, enemy combatant doctrine, invasions, occupations, assassination, and of course, the emergency never goes away. I mean, this is the value of emergency. Look at the Middle East. I've talked about this, about how Mubarak's got a 30-year emergency law that enabled him to go and pick up people off the streets. It's the same type of thing that exists in Syria. I forget which country over there has had it in existence, 50 years. It's the same thing as the enemy combatant doctrine that came into existence with the 9/11 emergency. The power to just label a person a terrorist, go out and pick him up, torture him, do whatever you want with him, and incarcerate him indefinitely, give him a military tribunal. This is the whole purpose of emergencies. This is why statists love emergencies, because people panic. The citizens say, oh, please keep me safe, do whatever is necessary. And the government always promises that the emergency is temporary. Well, then they use the emergency to consolidate power so that the emergency never ends. It's an ongoing emergency. With Lincoln, what Lincoln did during the Civil War emergency is he needed money. I mean, duh, what public official doesn't need money? They always need money. This is the power of the power lusting game. But he needed money to wage his war. Now, he taxed. I mean, that's the normal way that people in government collect the money. They could go out and tax the gold. But after he did that, there was a lot of resistance. There were like violent tax rebellions in New York and so forth that they had to put down with troops and so forth. So they figured the excess of the spending that they were still engaged in, they'll just start printing the notes. And it's sort of like borrowing. Like I said earlier, they're out there borrowing, but they're just issuing an excess of notes. Well, all of a sudden, people recognize that there's a lot of notes circulating out there. And so they start trading at a discount. In other words, when somebody walks into a hardware store with a U.S. government note, the hardware dealer says, I don't have confidence in that note. I'll give you 90% of what it's worth. You can buy, instead of $100, you can buy $90 worth of merchandise. And the customer says, but it's a $100 note. Tough luck, man. That thing ain't as good as gold. The government's issuing a lot of them. Well, Lincoln gets the wind of this, and like any of the emperors of old and the dictators of old, he gets insulted, and this is an dishonor to the king and to the president that you can't do this, and this is America, and these are our Federal Reserve notes. So he enacts, for the first time in the history of America, a legal tender law, where he says you have to accept these notes at face value. You have no choice. So now when the customer comes into the hardware store and the guy says, the customer says, you have to. And you have to take these in payment of debts too. Well, a lot of these creditors that, they were expecting to be paid, $100 on the dollar, and all of a sudden they're being paid in notes that are worth $90 in terms of gold. They're obviously unhappy. They're effectively having, 10% of their money or whatever the discount was stolen from them. So some of them sued, and the case reached the Supreme Court. And in a fascinating decision, very close, the Supreme Court said, this is not what America's all about. Now, this was after the war, but they said that, legal tender laws, the government doesn't have any power to issue legal tender laws. The government doesn't have any power to issue paper money. This is a gold country, a gold standard, gold money, where people are using gold as money. And so they just knocked this whole thing out. I mean, if the decision had stood, it would have been a remarkable decision for the history of the United States. Unfortunately, within, I don't know, 2 or 3 years, the composition of the court changed. I think one justice retired, two new ones were added, something like that. And it was one of the most shameful examples of politicizing the court, because they then revisited the legal tender cases and they overturned their own decision. I mean, it was just a straight decision based on the composition of the court. It was just absolutely shameful, because there's principles of stare decisis and predictability in the court and so forth. And so the statists won. And the legal tender laws were upheld, and the court held the government's got the power to do this. But even then, that emergency, it did end. I mean, this was one of those examples where it ended. The people returned to a gold standard. People were using gold as money throughout the 1800s, the late 1800s. Like I say, it was one of the reasons for this remarkable prosperity, notwithstanding the devastation of the Civil War. And so it was a remarkable time until, all of a sudden you come up to, 1929, 1930, the Great Depression. Emergency, red alert, red alert. You see, now it's not just terrorist emergencies that these people relish. It's, the wartime emergencies. I mean, they love the wartime emergencies because, man, that's when their powers are straight dictatorial powers. But economic emergencies, they relish those too. And that's exactly what Roosevelt did. He says, we've got a temporary emergency here, but it's just like war. We've got to fight this thing like a war. And of course, what he meant was like World War I, which, was run in a very, America was being run like in a very militarist, command and control society during that time. Now, what had happened was that in the meantime, in 1913, you've got the adoption of the income tax. The statists won that one, okay? So for the first time in history, people's income is now being taxed. With the exception of the Civil War, Lincoln had tried there too and done that, and that had been declared unconstitutional. But all of a sudden, 1913 authorizes the adoption of the income tax. That was, and then you've got the Federal Reserve Act that brings into existence a central bank. Now, what was the purported purpose of the central bank, the Federal Reserve? Oh, they were going to stabilize the monetary system. You see, they were going to make it everything stable, because you did have these periods of panics or booms or whatever in the market. For example, they would just discover gold in San Francisco or something, and all of a sudden you'd have a big increase in prices because of this influx in the money supply. But by and large, these panics and so forth would work themselves out very quickly. Well, all of a sudden, here comes the Federal Reserve, and man, they crank up the printing press. Okay, now you've heard of the Roaring '20s. Well, they cranked up the printing press, and of course the IRS, the tax machine too, to finance World War I, which I think every statist would acknowledge. No statist, from what I understand, defends World War I. I mean, they still defend World War II, but I don't know one statist that defends World War I. I mean, it was a total waste of American life. I mean, to make the world safe for democracy, yeah, that was a big winner. Or this was the war to bring peace to the world permanently, yeah, right, another winner. But during that war and then through the 20s, the Fed is cranking up the note printing business, you see. Now they got a printing press. Now they got a central bank. And man, things are roaring, stimulus out the gazoo. I mean, they're really having a good time. But remember what I said is that people start figuring out, and they start, there's going to be a run on the bank. And they get wind of this, and they figure it, the government does it. Uh-oh, we've overprinted. And we can't handle the gold runs here. So they panic and they contract the money supply. And they overcontract. They overshot the mark. And that's what caused the stock market crash. Now, what have we all been taught in the public government schools that we're forced to go to and our parents are forced to send us to? Are we taught that? Not on your life. What they have always taught, and what they taught our parents, and what they taught our grandparents to a certain extent, the ones that were still in public schools and state universities, is that this was the failure of America's free enterprise system. Okay? In other words, they blamed the stock market crash, the Great Depression, on free enterprise. Well, of course, Because can you imagine how people would have reacted if they had known that this central bank that had come into existence in 1913 had caused this thing? I mean, there could have been a revolution in this country. I mean, there would have been a lot of anger against government officials. To deflect that anger, government officials lied. And they lied, and they said, oh, Roosevelt said, this is the failure of free enterprise. This shows the excesses of free enterprise, why capitalism overproduces. And they had their little intellectuals to support them, you know. Oh, there's overconsumption, there's overproduction, and all this nonsense to keep attention away from the crux, and that was the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is what caused the Great Depression, all right? And you even have an acknowledgement. Of course, the Austrians have documented this really well. Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, who ended up winning the Nobel Prize. You've got Milton Friedman, the Chicago School, documenting that this is what caused the Great Depression. Ben Bernanke, chairman of the Federal Reserve, he was at a party in memory of Milton Friedman's. It was a birthday party, a big dinner. He acknowledged at that dinner that the Federal Reserve actually was the culprit in the Great Depression. So here you've got this government institution that caused the emergency. But what Roosevelt does, surprise, surprise, he capitalizes on the emergency. He's not going to let this emergency go to waste. He's a power luster. He's the kind of people that our American ancestors were concerned about, that government would attract into office. And he's the example par excellence, I mean, of a statist. I mean, this guy sees the opportunity and says, but now he doesn't say I'm going to adopt socialist methods. He doesn't say I'm going to adopt fascist methods. But that's exactly what he does. He just couches them in terms of free enterprise reforms. He tells people, I'm going to save free enterprise. So he revolutionizes America's economic life. I mean, here's where Social Security got established, which, by the way, had its roots in German socialism. That's why it's not a surprise that Hitler, at the same time that Roosevelt was incorporating Social Security as part of our way of life, Hitler already had it as part of his way of life, because that's where it originated. It originated under Otto von Bismarck, who got it from the German socialists. And of course, the seeds were planted for Medicare and Medicaid, the whole transfer society, the welfare state. And but Roosevelt was smart enough to know, and the statists were smart enough to know. Now here was the triumph of statism. I mean, this was the ultimate triumph, that throughout the latter part of the 1800s, you've got the statists are battling. They're battling for their socialism. They're battling for their interventionism. They're battling for their alcohol laws and their drug laws and so forth. But they're getting beat down by the libertarians, the people that still believe in economic liberty and freedom and a limited government republic. But as the 20th century goes on, and up to about 1930, the battle is over. The statists reign triumphant, and Roosevelt's their icon. Well, guess what he does? Now, remember that for almost 150 years, from 1787 or so, all the way up through 1930s, people are using gold. I mean, this is the money of the United States. Guess what Roosevelt does? He realizes that now with his newfangled welfare state, and out of that would come the warfare state, you need massive expenditures. Okay? In other words, you need unlimited powers to spend money, to borrow money. Roosevelt understood that. There was only one way to do that, and that was to be able to crank up the printing presses without worrying about gold runs where people demand their money. And so what he did was the most unbelievable, one of the most shameful, unconscionable acts that could ever be done. He nationalizes gold. Now what does that mean? It means that he orders every American to turn in his privately held gold to the government. It's no different from what Castro did in Cuba when he nationalized all the businesses there, the tobacco industries and so forth and the farms. That it was no different than from what Stalin was doing on nationalizing businesses and so forth. Roosevelt nationalized everybody's gold. He made it a felony offense to own gold. So everybody had to give up their gold to the government. Some people didn't. They said, no, we're not going to do it. But those that got caught were prosecuted ruthlessly with a felony prosecution. I mean, they were looking at many, many years in the penitentiary. And so imagine that here people, the American people, use gold and silver coins for 100 years as money, and now they're felons. They're felons. And Roosevelt's saying, but it's just because there's an emergency. It's only because there's an emergency. Well, of course, that's the benefit of an emergency. It never goes away. Do you see gold and silver circulating as money today? Of course not. Well, the emergency of the Great Depression ended many, many decades ago. But that's the way emergencies work. They're always going to be temporary. Oh, we'll return your gold to you. Oh, don't worry. This is just, we're going to battle this thing like war, but by golly, we'll come out on top and everything is going to be hunky-dory. Nonsense. They revolutionized American life. They used the Fed, the emergency of the Fed, the Great Depression, to then take away people's gold in order to then have a system that could do an onslaught of paper money. Now there was no limit on how much they could spend and borrow, because you see, they'd collect some in taxes, and it's never enough. They're always going to spend more than what they're bringing in taxes, so they borrow the money. But now they didn't need to worry about any gold runs on them, except in international, because you still had the gold standard internationally. So they still had to worry about foreign central banks demanding their gold. That ended under the Richard Nixon regime, where he closed the gold window and totally said, no gold standard, no gold is money in this country ever again. But for the American people, while the rest of the world is owning gold and trading in gold, the American people are felons if they try. Now, why did Roosevelt do this? Why did he feel he had to nationalize? Why didn't he just enact legal tender laws and use paper money? Because he knew, and the statists knew, that they had to smash out of the collective conscience of the American people any remembrance of gold as money. And they knew that it would take 2 or 3 generations, but they had to have that time so that they would end up in the situation where we are today, where everybody who's born, everybody who's raised, all they know is the paper money system, the central bank, the Federal Reserve System. That all that memory of gold as money is gone, it's evaporated. And that's why they felt they had to confiscate it, they had to nationalize it, as compared to what Lincoln had done and just say, hey, this is paper money, legal tender, you can continue owning gold, fine. Now, they also did not, now, so as people were turning in their gold, they were getting paid for it, with paper notes, but irredeemable notes. And then guess what happens as soon as they turn in their gold? Roosevelt and his cronies devalued the paper money. So it was just legalized stealing. I mean, it was moral debauchery in its worst form. But for decades, if you got caught owning some gold coins that were not numismatic, because that was one of the exceptions, but just holding gold coins, you were a felon. You would be, and they would come after you. They're vicious, these people. They would prosecute you in federal court, and they would send you up to the Hooskow of the federal penitentiary, not just to punish you, but to send a message to every other American. Now, why were they so much against gold? What was another reason? Well, gold is a store of value. It's a way to protect yourself from this onslaught of paper money coming out. Remember, I talked about not worth a Continental and the German hyperinflation and the Zimbabwe situation. Well, this is how people protect themselves from an inflationary, onslaught, hyperinflation, or whatever. That gold is a store of value. That people buy gold. It's easily transportable. It's portable. It can be. It's a little bit cumbersome, but you can hold a lot of it in a home safe. Now, it's not necessarily that you're going to make a lot of money or you make any money at all, but you're going to be able to keep the value of the savings that you have. So as the paper money debases, as it depreciates, as it devalues, that's reflected in rising prices of everything around you. But if you've got gold, that's rising in price along with everything else. So when the thing finally shakes out, you've still got a store of value by which to buy things, as compared to the person that's, he's dealing with his wheelbarrow full of paper money. Well, governments don't like you doing that. They don't like you protecting yourself against the inflationary onslaught that they bring on. They want to debase people's values, their value of their savings and so forth. They want to take the money. They don't want to go tax it necessarily, because people get mad when you raise their taxes. Much easier to go and inflate their savings out of existence, or inflate their income out of existence. And then what do? Well, it's the status ideal situation. They blame the rising prices on the greed, the banksters, the oil companies, OPEC, big oil, illegal aliens. I mean, wherever they are, and people buy into this because everybody goes to public schools. So when they see price, you see it now. Now, I predicted this. You can go back to my articles for the last 3 years. I said when gasoline prices start to rise, because they're now really debasing the currency, they're going to go and blame it on, those greedy grocery store, gas station stores, or the grocery stores are going to blame it on them, or the oil companies. And sure enough, I read in the paper today where, there's members of Congress exclaiming they want an investigation into the oil companies. They're raising all these unnecessary gas prices and so forth. And really what it is, it's a reflection of the debasement of the currency. But this is what they do every time. They blame it on the people raising the prices to deflect attention away from the Federal Reserve, which is debasing the currency. And that's, again, that's following what Roosevelt did, deflect the attention away from the central bank. And so that's where we are today. I mean, you've got a system of where, the paper money is irredeemable. I mean, you may carry around a promissory note in your pocket. You can't go and demand the gold that note once represented. It's irredeemable. And they're printing like there was no tomorrow. Why? Well, because the national debt's so high. And they keep borrowing it. Now, what are they going to do? The crunch time is coming here. The crunch time really is here. They've got the warfare state, going big time. They've got occupying 2 countries. They're bombing, 4 or 5 countries? Hard to keep track nowadays. They've got, close to 700 to 1,000 military bases all over the world. They've got, troops everywhere all over the world. They've got the warfare state. And you've got the conservatives that are saying, you ain't going to stop our defense. And what they mean by defense is the empire. They don't talk about, a country attacking the United States, because there ain't no country attacking the United States. No country's got the money, the military means, or even the inclination of crossing the oceans to invade and occupy the United States. And so what they call defense is this gigantic empire. That's what conservatives mean by, what's what liberals mean by defense too, the Department of Defense. And even if the Democrats say, we're going to cut a little bit of defense, you're talking about picky-uni cuts in defense. They will not let go of their empire. They like all these military bases everywhere. They like the foreign aid. They like the partnerships with the dictatorships. They like the torture partnerships. They think like imperialists, okay? They think like the Roman Empire. You got generals marching around Washington, with this air of gravitas, just like the Roman Empire. You walk around Washington and you get a sense of what it was like to walk around Rome at the height of the empire, where they were stirring up foreign wars everywhere, and, the terrorist threat, the barbarians are at the gates, and there's always an emergency. But they had welfare, the bread and circuses, to pacify the people. And so you don't see government officials calling for dismantling all this militarism and the invasions and occupations. In fact, they say the opposite, that national security depends on them continuing to bomb and kill people overseas. So nothing's going to happen there. But over here, you've got the welfare to pacify the people, to keep the people drugged up, the Social Security, the Medicare, the Medicaid. This is what keeps people mollified and dependent on the government, and believing in, this is our daddy and this is our welfare provider, and what would we do without our welfare, and so forth. So notice, nobody talks about dismantling Medicare, Medicaid, or Social Security, the big ones, much less the education grants, the welfare, the foreign aid, and so forth. It's all just claptrap. They're talking about reform this and reform that, and that's standard status talk. We're going to reform, we're going to reform, we're going to reform. And, their reform plan is always better than everybody else's reform plan. Well, crunch time is here, because you've got this gigantic national debt. Now you got this debt ceiling that was supposedly a promise that they would not exceed that ceiling. The ceiling is a ceiling, and that a year ago, whenever they had the last extension, they said, okay, we're going to raise it, but that's it. And because it's an acknowledgement that too much debt's a very dangerous thing. You got Standards & Poor now downgrading American debt or threatening to do so. And so too much debt's there. And yet they keep spending and borrowing and spending and borrowing. Well, what are they going to do? They're not going to tax. Now, they can talk about taxing the rich all they want, but there's not that much money out there in the rich to pull this off. They use the Federal Reserve for this. They do what they've done, because this isn't the first time that this has happened. They've done this decade after decade after decade. They have these little emergencies and too much debt and too much spending, and man, they crank up the printing press. And that's why the value of these paper reserve notes that are in your wallet, a dollar's worth about 5% of what it was when the Fed was established. This is what they have done to our money and to our monetary system. They've debased it, they've devalued it, they depreciated it, they have damaged us. I mean, they have hurt us. I mean, if you want to talk about threats to the security of the American people, the Federal Reserve ranks right up there near the top, along with the IRS and of course, the warfare state that's producing all the terrorist threat that then is used as an excuse to take away our liberties with the enemy combatant doctrine and the Patriot Act and the body searches at the airports. It all comes together, is what I'm suggesting to you, is that you've got a warfare state, you've got a welfare state, and then you've got the engines to fund this, to pay for it out of the private sector. The IRS being one, the Federal Reserve being the other. And all this can only end badly. There cannot be a good end to this. Talk to people that know about the Roman Empire or the Soviet Empire or the British Empire. There's only one real solution to this, and that's libertarianism. And this is what I've been stressing every week since I started the show. There is just one solution, and it isn't reforming the welfare state. It doesn't lie with reforming the warfare state. It lies with an entirely different paradigm, a paradigm of liberty, of sound money, of private charity, of keeping everything you earn, of deciding what to do with your own money. This is what a free society is all about, not this welfarism and warfarism and central banking, which is really just a form of socialist central planning. I mean, that's what the Fed is. And we all know what socialist central planning produces. It produces monetary chaos and distortions in the marketplace. What we've got to do, the Americans living today, is we've got to reevaluate where we stand here. And you reevaluate by going back to first principles. What were the principles of liberty that our ancestors were trying to establish? Setting aside the horrible exceptions of slavery and so forth. What was the good things that they were doing with no income tax, no welfare, no Social Security? Yes to sound money. Yes to open borders. No to drug wars. What were they trying to say? What was the outcome of this? What was the real cause of the Great Depression? What had been the results of this revolution of the welfare state, the socialism of the welfare state, the interventionist state, the drug war, the regulated economy, the regulated society, the warfare state, the bases overseas, the bases here, the militarism? What have been the results of this? And what I'm suggesting to you is that when people look at this closely and forget about reforming the statism, they'll see that the statism is filled with rot, just nothing but cancerous rot, and that the only solution is radical surgery. Get rid of that cancerous rot and restore a free, prosperous, dynamic, harmonious, charitable nation to our land. And that lies with libertarianism. And that, of course, includes sound money, abolishing the Federal Reserve, repealing all legal tender laws, and as Friedrich Hayek, the Nobel laureate libertarian economist, said, a denationalization of money. Let the market make these determinations. That's our heritage, economic liberty and free markets. It's time that we restore that heritage to our land. That's my show tonight. I had a great time visiting with you as always. See you next week. Thank you.